The moment power mistakes dignity for weakness, justice begins writing a different ending. The rain had started before sunrise, soft enough to blur the neon glow reflecting across the windows of Miller's Diner, the kind of neighborhood place where regulars knew each other's names and the coffee was always ready before the front door finished closing. The smell of fresh bacon, buttered toast, and strong Colombian roast drifted through the room, while quiet conversations mixed with the gentle clatter of silverware against ceramic plates. It looked like an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that promised nothing more dramatic than a long commute and another day at work. Yet sometimes history walks into a room without introducing itself. At the booth beside the front window sat a woman dressed in a simple navy blazer, reading through a folder thick with policy notes highlighted in careful blue ink. She wore no expensive jewelry, no security detail hovered nearby, and nothing about her appearance invited attention. Her name was Evelyn Carter, and to everyone around her, she looked like another professional enjoying breakfast before an early meeting. She thanked the waitress with a warm smile as a fresh cup of coffee was placed beside her, then quietly returned to reading, occasionally making small notes in the margin with a black fountain pen. Across the diner, Grace Miller polished glasses behind the counter while greeting familiar customers as they came through the door. She noticed Evelyn's calm presence almost immediately. There was something reassuring about the woman, the kind of confidence that never demanded recognition because it had already earned it. Near the kitchen entrance, 19-year-old Noah Brooks balanced 2 plates of pancakes while learning the morning rush one order at a time. He admired people who treated restaurant workers with kindness, and the woman by the window had thanked every employee she encountered without once looking impatient. Outside, the rain slowed into a mist as a white patrol SUV rolled into the parking lot. The tires crunched across wet gravel before stopping near the entrance. Officer Brandon Hayes stepped out, adjusted his duty belt, and glanced through the diner's front windows before pushing the door open. The tiny brass bell above the entrance chimed once. Conversations softened for a moment. Hayes had become a familiar face around town, though not everyone smiled when they saw him. Some respected the badge. Others remembered stories whispered after difficult traffic stops and uncomfortable encounters that never seemed to become official complaints. He scanned the room with practiced confidence until his eyes settled on Evelyn's booth. She remained focused on the papers in front of her, unaware that she had become the center of his attention. Hayes frowned almost instantly. Something about seeing a black woman sitting alone in the booth usually reserved for visiting officials stirred an assumption that settled into certainty before a single word had been spoken. He slowly approached her table, his boots echoing across the polished tile floor while the conversations around him faded into uneasy silence. Grace looked up from behind the counter, sensing the atmosphere changing before she understood why. Noah instinctively slowed his pace, carefully setting down a customer's breakfast without taking his eyes off the unfolding scene. Evelyn calmly turned another page in her folder just as a shadow stretched across the table. She looked up with composed eyes, meeting the officer's stare without fear or hostility. Neither of them knew that within the next few minutes, one phone call would expose the difference between authority and character, and everyone inside Miller's Diner would remember exactly where they were when the truth answered the phone. Officer Brandon Hayes rested one hand on the edge of the booth and looked down at the folder spread neatly across the table. His expression carried the confidence of someone who believed that wearing a badge meant his instincts never needed to be questioned. Evelyn Carter slowly closed the folder without rushing, carefully placing her pen beside the warm coffee cup before meeting his eyes again. Her voice remained calm and respectful. "Good morning, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" Hayes did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the diner as though searching for someone who might explain why she was sitting there. "This booth is usually reserved," he finally said. "I have never seen you here before." Evelyn offered a polite smile that revealed neither irritation nor fear. "The owner invited me to sit here. I am only finishing breakfast before an important meeting." Grace Miller immediately stepped away from the counter, sensing that the conversation was becoming uncomfortable. "Officer Hayes," she said carefully, "she is a paying customer. Everything is perfectly fine." Hayes barely acknowledged Grace before returning his attention to Evelyn. "I will decide what is fine," he replied. The words settled heavily across the quiet room. Forks stopped moving. Coffee cups remained suspended halfway to waiting lips. Noah Brooks stood beside the pie display, holding an empty tray, unable to look away. Evelyn folded her hands together on the table. Years of public service had taught her that composure often revealed more strength than arguments ever could. "Is there a reason you are questioning me?" she asked. Hayes nodded slowly. "People have called about suspicious activity before. Someone sitting alone, studying government papers, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. That raises questions." Evelyn glanced briefly at the folder before looking back at him. "Reading documents during breakfast is not against the law." Her answer was simple, almost gentle, but it seemed only to deepen his certainty that he was right. Hayes crossed his arms. "Do you have identification?" Around the diner, several customers exchanged uncertain glances. An elderly couple quietly whispered to each other. A truck driver near the entrance lowered his newspaper without saying a word. Grace stepped closer again. "Officer, she has not disturbed anyone." Hayes answered without turning around. "Ma'am, I am conducting official business." Evelyn reached toward her purse with slow, deliberate movements, making certain every gesture remained visible. Before opening it, she paused. "May I ask whether I am being accused of anything?" Hayes shook his head. "Not yet." The two words lingered in the air. Longer than anyone expected. Evelyn understood exactly what they meant. She had spent years listening to stories from people whose ordinary mornings had become unforgettable because assumptions had replaced evidence. She had promised herself that whenever such a moment reached her own life, she would respond with dignity rather than anger. As she opened her purse, her cellular phone lit up against the leather lining. The screen displayed a familiar name before the vibration quietly echoed across the tabletop. Governor William Monroe calling. Evelyn looked at the screen for only a second before gently silencing the call. "I will return it in a few minutes," she said softly to herself. Hayes noticed the phone, but not the name. His attention remained fixed on proving the suspicion he had already accepted as truth. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving only tiny drops clinging to the diner's front windows while the morning sunlight slowly pushed through the gray clouds, illuminating a room where appearances still held more influence than facts, at least for the moment. The quiet vibration from the unanswered call faded, but the silence inside Miller's diner only grew heavier. Officer Brandon Hayes watched Evelyn Carter with narrowed eyes as she removed a simple leather wallet from her purse instead of immediately handing it to him. She placed it carefully beside her coffee cup without opening it. "Officer," she said with steady composure, "I believe respect works both ways. I have answered every question you have asked. I would appreciate understanding why you believe I have done something suspicious." Hayes let out a short breath that sounded more like impatience than thought. "You fit the circumstances that I am evaluating." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Which circumstances are those?" He glanced around the room before answering. "Someone unfamiliar. Government paperwork. Refusing to cooperate." Grace Miller quietly shook her head behind the counter. Every customer in the diner had watched Evelyn cooperate from the very beginning. Noah Brooks felt his stomach tighten as he looked from the officer to the woman sitting calmly in the booth. He had seen difficult conversations before, but never one where the facts and the assumptions seemed so far apart. Evelyn slowly opened her wallet and revealed her identification holder without removing anything from it. "Before I continue," she said gently, "I would like to know whether I am free to finish my breakfast after this conversation." Hayes did not respond to her question. Instead, he leaned forward just enough to study her face more closely, almost as though he expected nervousness to appear if he waited long enough. It never did. Her breathing remained even. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her eyes reflected patience instead of fear. That confidence unsettled him more than any argument could have. He believed people with nothing to hide usually tried harder to prove themselves. Evelyn did not. She simply waited for fairness to catch up with the moment. Outside, morning traffic increased along the street, while sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting bright reflections across the diner's front windows. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained frozen. A retired schoolteacher quietly folded her newspaper and whispered to her husband, "Something about this does not feel right." Across the aisle, a construction foreman looked toward the entrance as though expecting another officer to walk in and ease the tension. No one came. Hayes extended his hand. "Identification." Evelyn calmly removed a government identification card but kept it in her own hand. "I will gladly identify myself," she replied. "But I would also appreciate your name and badge number for my records." The request was courteous, completely lawful, and delivered without the slightest hint of confrontation. Yet Hayes interpreted it as defiance. His expression hardened. "You do not ask the questions here." Evelyn nodded once. "No, officer. I simply believe accountability belongs to everyone." Those words settled over the room like a sudden change in weather. Grace looked down at the countertop, wishing the encounter would end before it became something the town would regret remembering. Noah quietly reached into his apron and slipped his cellular phone into recording mode without raising it above the counter. He did not know why he felt compelled to preserve the moment. He only knew that truth sometimes depended on ordinary people paying attention. At that exact instant, Evelyn's phone vibrated again across the table. The screen illuminated the polished wood with the same unmistakable message as before. Governor William Monroe calling. This time several nearby customers noticed the name, but before anyone could speak, Hayes reached toward the table with complete confidence, convinced that the next few moments would validate every assumption he had already made, while no one in the diner realized that the truth was only one answered call away. Officer Brandon Hayes reached toward the vibrating phone before Evelyn Carter calmly placed her hand over it. She did not grab it. She did not pull it away. She simply rested her fingertips lightly across the screen until the vibration stopped. "This is personal property," she said with quiet confidence. "Please allow me to answer it when we have finished speaking." Hayes withdrew his hand, but only for a moment. His pride had quietly replaced his judgment, and every respectful response from Evelyn seemed to convince him that she was concealing something important. "You can answer calls after I determine who you are," he replied. Evelyn looked directly at him, her expression unchanged. "Officer, I have already agreed to identify myself. I have not refused a single lawful request." Grace Miller stepped forward again, drying her hands on a kitchen towel that she had forgotten she was holding. "Brandon," she said gently. "She has been here almost 40 minutes. She greeted everyone. She ordered breakfast. She has done absolutely nothing that has disturbed this restaurant." Hayes answered without looking away from Evelyn. "Sometimes trouble does not announce itself." The sentence settled over the room like an unwelcome shadow. Noah Brooks glanced around the diner and noticed that nearly every customer had stopped eating. An elderly veteran quietly removed his reading glasses. A mother seated with her young son placed her hand over the child's shoulder, sensing that something uncomfortable was unfolding even if he did not understand why. Evelyn slowly slid her identification holder across the table but kept it closed. "Before you examine this," she said, "I would appreciate one simple courtesy. Please tell me exactly why you believe I am under suspicion." Hayes hesitated. The question sounded reasonable, yet he found himself unwilling to admit that his conclusion had formed long before he had gathered any facts. "Your behavior raised concerns," he finally answered. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "Reading documents, drinking coffee, speaking politely. Those are the behaviors you are referring to." A few customers exchanged uneasy looks. No one laughed. No one spoke. The silence itself seemed to answer the question. Hayes felt every pair of eyes in the diner resting on him, and instead of reconsidering his approach, he became even more determined to assert his authority. "Stand up," he instructed firmly. Evelyn looked at him for a long second before calmly pushing her chair back and rising to her feet. She did not protest. She did not argue. She simply stood with quiet dignity, folding her hands in front of her while waiting for the next instruction. Grace took an anxious step closer. "Officer, is that really necessary?" Hayes responded with practiced certainty. "I am conducting an investigation." Evelyn spoke softly enough that only those closest could hear every word. "The strength of an investigation is measured by evidence, not assumptions." The sentence lingered in the air. Noah felt a chill despite the warm smell of fresh coffee surrounding him. He had expected anger. Instead, he witnessed remarkable restraint, and somehow that made the moment even heavier. Just then, Evelyn's cellular phone illuminated the tabletop for a third time. The familiar name appeared once again across the bright screen. Governor William Monroe calling. This time the display remained visible long enough for Grace to notice it clearly. Her eyes widened for only an instant before she looked back at Evelyn, who gave the slightest shake of her head, as if silently asking her not to interrupt. Hayes never noticed Grace's reaction. His attention remained fixed on proving that the woman standing before him did not belong where she was. In only a few more moments, that certainty would collide with a truth powerful enough to change every conversation inside Miller's diner forever. The room seemed to hold its breath as Officer Brandon Hayes took one deliberate step closer. The breakfast crowd no longer sounded like a breakfast crowd. Coffee cups rested untouched. Conversations had disappeared. Even the old wall clock above the counter seemed louder than before, each passing second stretching the tension tighter across the diner. Evelyn Carter remained standing beside the booth with remarkable composure, her hands resting naturally in front of her. She neither challenged the officer nor retreated from him. Instead, she spoke with the quiet confidence that comes from years of serving people who often disagreed with one another. "Officer Hayes," she said gently, "every decision we make in public becomes an example for someone else. That is true for elected officials, and it is equally true for law enforcement." Hayes answered with a restrained smile that carried little warmth. "Then perhaps you should cooperate completely and stop making this more difficult." Evelyn gave a small nod. "I have cooperated from the moment you walked through that door." Grace Miller could no longer hide her concern. She stepped around the counter until she stood only a few feet away. "Brandon, please listen. She has been respectful the entire time. There is no reason for this to continue." Hayes looked toward Grace only briefly. "This does not involve you." Grace lowered her voice. "It involves my restaurant and every customer inside it." Across the room, Noah Brooks quietly continued recording, not because he expected drama, but because he sensed that ordinary moments sometimes became important only after they had passed. The elderly veteran near the front window slowly folded his hands together while watching Evelyn with admiration. He had served his country decades earlier and recognized a kind of discipline that could not be taught overnight. It was the discipline of someone who understood that character revealed itself most clearly when others abandoned theirs. Evelyn looked down for a moment at the folder still resting on the table. The pages contained months of legislative work focused on improving trust between communities and police departments. Listening sessions, accountability measures, officer wellness programs, expanded training, independent review procedures. She had spent countless evenings speaking with officers, families, community leaders, and victims alike because she believed lasting reform could never come from choosing one side over another. It required every voice willing to tell the truth. That morning's meeting at the state capitol had been scheduled for weeks. Governor William Monroe had personally requested her attendance before a bipartisan committee prepared to vote on the largest public safety reform package the state had considered in years. The irony was impossible to ignore. The very principles she hoped to strengthen were now being tested in front of strangers over eggs, toast, and cooling cups of coffee. Her cellular phone remained silent for the first time in several minutes, but the unanswered calls lingered in everyone's mind, especially Grace's. She knew exactly whose name she had seen on the screen, yet she honored Evelyn's silent request by saying nothing. Hayes extended his hand once more. "Give me the identification." Evelyn slowly opened the holder and looked at the card inside for only a brief moment before lifting her eyes back to him. "I will," she answered softly, "because I believe transparency matters." She carefully removed the card, but before she could place it into his hand, another vibration echoed across the tabletop. The phone illuminated the diner once again. This time the incoming call was accompanied by a text message preview that briefly appeared beneath the familiar name. It read, "We are waiting for you in the Capitol conference room. Please answer as soon as possible." Grace saw the message. Noah noticed it from several feet away. A construction worker near the entrance quietly whispered, "Governor?" Hayes, however, never looked at the screen. His attention remained fixed on the identification card that was only inches away from revealing a truth he had never imagined, while the morning that had begun with quiet routine stood on the edge of becoming a lesson no one inside Miller's diner would ever forget. Officer Brandon Hayes accepted the identification card with the certainty of a man expecting confirmation rather than surprise. He barely glanced at Evelyn Carter before lowering his eyes to the card. The confidence on his face remained unchanged for only a second. He read the name once. Then he read it again more carefully. His expression tightened, not because he believed the card, but because he refused to. "This cannot be right," he said quietly. Evelyn answered with the same calm voice she had used from the beginning. "It is an official government identification." Hayes turned the card over, studying every detail as though a hidden flaw would suddenly appear. "Anyone can carry a convincing card," he replied. "Identification alone does not prove anything." Around the diner, several customers exchanged uneasy looks. Grace Miller slowly closed her eyes for a brief moment, hoping the conversation would finally end before it crossed a line that could not be erased. Noah Brooks continued recording without moving, realizing that each passing minute revealed less about the woman being questioned and far more about the assumptions guiding the questions themselves. Evelyn folded her hands once again. "Officer Hayes, I understand that verifying identity is part of your responsibility. If you would like to confirm my credentials through official channels, I will wait patiently." There was no sarcasm in her voice, no challenge, only quiet cooperation. Yet Hayes interpreted her patience as confidence that needed to be tested. He reached toward his radio but hesitated. Something inside him resisted taking the simple step that could settle the matter. Instead, he looked around the diner as though searching for agreement from the silent audience. None came. The elderly veteran lowered his eyes. The construction workers avoided speaking. Even the mother with her young son gently guided the child to look at his coloring book instead of the unfolding confrontation. Evelyn noticed the silence and understood it well. Silence often came from discomfort rather than approval. She had spent years visiting schools, churches, police academies, and town halls where difficult conversations began only after someone found the courage to replace assumptions with facts. That belief had shaped every mile she traveled across the state and every law she helped write. Her work was never about winning arguments. It was about earning trust one conversation at a time. She thought briefly about the committee waiting at the Capitol. Months of hearings had led to that morning. Police chiefs, sheriffs, civil rights advocates, prosecutors, and community organizations had finally reached common ground on reforms designed to strengthen public confidence while supporting officers who served with integrity. Governor William Monroe had insisted that the legislation be presented together as a symbol that justice and public safety should never stand on opposite sides. Evelyn had promised she would arrive early to review the final language before the session began. Instead, she now stood inside a neighborhood diner watching that schedule quietly disappear minute by minute. Her cellular phone illuminated once more across the table. This time the vibration was followed almost immediately by another. Then another. The display showed multiple missed calls from Governor William Monroe along with new messages from members of the governor's staff asking whether she was safe and requesting an immediate response. Grace could read enough from where she stood to understand that concern had replaced routine. Hayes still refused to look directly at the screen. "Until I determine exactly who you are," he said firmly. "This conversation is not over." Evelyn met his eyes with remarkable composure. "Officer, sometimes the fastest way to discover the truth is simply to answer the phone." For the first time that morning, uncertainty flickered across his face, and although he tried to hide it, everyone inside Miller's diner could see that confidence had quietly begun giving way to doubt. Officer Brandon Hayes looked from the government identification card back to Evelyn Carter, searching her face for the uncertainty he expected to find. Instead, he found the same steady expression that had greeted him from the moment he entered the diner. The silence between them stretched until another vibration echoed across the tabletop. This time the phone did not stop after a single call. It rang again almost immediately, the bright screen illuminating the polished wood with the same unmistakable name. Governor William Monroe calling. Hayes hesitated. For the first time that morning, his confidence collided with a possibility he had refused to consider. Evelyn spoke quietly, almost as if she were offering him a way to end the misunderstanding before it grew any larger. "Officer Hayes, I would like to answer the call." He tightened his grip on the identification card. "Not yet." Grace Miller could not remain silent any longer. "Brandon, please look at the screen." He did not respond. Noah Brooks shifted slightly behind the counter, making certain his recording continued. Every customer in the diner watched without speaking, sensing that the next decision would matter far more than anything that had happened before. The phone rang once more. Then it stopped. A second later, another notification appeared. Incoming video call. Governor William Monroe. Even from several feet away, The words were impossible to miss. Hayes slowly lowered his eyes toward the display. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. The certainty that had carried him through the entire encounter gave way to confusion. Before he could react, the phone began ringing again. Evelyn calmly extended her hand. "Please." There was no anger in her voice. No satisfaction. Only patience. After a long pause, Hayes placed the phone into her hand. Evelyn accepted it with a simple nod and answered immediately. "Good morning, Governor." The entire diner became perfectly still. Governor Monroe's concerned voice filled the quiet room through the speaker. "Senator Carter, we have been trying to reach you for nearly 20 minutes. The committee is assembled, the press is waiting, and everyone is asking where you are. Is everything all right?" Evelyn glanced briefly toward Officer Hayes before answering with remarkable composure. "Governor, I am safe. There has been an unexpected delay while my identity has been verified." The governor paused for a moment. "Verified? By whom?" Evelyn never raised her voice. "A local officer believed additional questions were necessary before allowing me to continue to the Capitol." Several customers quietly lowered their heads. Grace closed her eyes. Noah watched Officer Hayes as the color slowly disappeared from his face. Governor Monroe spoke again, his tone now unmistakably serious. "May I speak with the officer, please?" Evelyn looked toward Hayes and gently held out the phone. He stared at it without moving. His shoulders, so rigid only moments earlier, now seemed unexpectedly heavy. Finally, he accepted the phone with unsteady hands. "Governor," he began quietly. Before he could continue, the governor interrupted with calm authority. "Officer Hayes, this is Governor William Monroe. Senator Evelyn Carter is expected to stand beside me this morning as we present the most significant public safety reform legislation our state has considered in decades. I need you to explain why she has been prevented from attending." No one inside Miller's diner breathed a word. The only sound came from the soft hum of the coffee machines behind the counter. Hayes opened his mouth, searching for an explanation that suddenly seemed impossible to find. Every assumption he had relied upon only minutes earlier now stood exposed beneath the weight of simple facts. And for the first time since walking through the front door, he realized that authority, without careful judgment, could become its own greatest mistake. Officer Brandon Hayes struggled to find the right words, but every explanation sounded weaker before it ever reached his lips. The governor remained silent for a moment, allowing the weight of the question to settle. Finally, Hayes spoke carefully. "Governor, I believed I was following proper procedure." Governor William Monroe answered with measured restraint rather than anger. "Proper procedure begins with facts, officer. It never begins with assumptions." Those words echoed through the diner with far greater force than any raised voice could have carried. Hayes lowered his eyes. Across the room, every customer remained silent, witnessing a lesson that no training manual could fully teach. Governor Monroe continued, "Please return the phone to Senator Carter." Hayes immediately handed the phone back. Evelyn accepted it with the same grace she had shown throughout the entire encounter. "Governor, I apologize for the delay," she said. "There is nothing for you to apologize for," Governor Monroe replied. "The committee can wait a few more minutes. Justice cannot." A quiet stillness settled over the room. Grace Miller wiped away a tear she had not realized had formed. Noah Brooks slowly lowered his phone for the first time since recording began, understanding that the most important part of the story was no longer what had happened, but how people chose to respond afterward. Governor Monroe spoke once more. "Senator Carter, I have already contacted the Department of Public Safety. The chief of the state police has been informed, and your local police chief is on the way to the diner. Please remain there until they arrive." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you, Governor. I appreciate your confidence." After the call ended, no one spoke for several long seconds. Officer Hayes stood motionless beside the booth, his earlier certainty completely gone. The government identification card remained in his hand, now feeling heavier than it had only minutes before. Evelyn looked at him without resentment. "Officer Hayes," she said softly, "today is not only about me. Every person deserves to be treated with the same patience you would hope someone would show your own family." Hayes swallowed quietly. For the first time, he seemed to understand the difference between authority and trust. "Senator Carter," he answered, "I made a serious mistake." Evelyn did not interrupt him. "I allowed my assumptions to become conclusions before I knew the facts. Grace stepped forward carrying a fresh cup of coffee. She gently placed it on the table where Evelyn had been sitting earlier. "It is on the house," she said with a small smile. Evelyn thanked her warmly before turning back toward Hayes. "Mistakes can become lessons," she replied. "Only if we are willing to learn from them." Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the quiet morning. Through the front windows, several official state vehicles slowly entered the parking lot, followed by the marked sedan of the town police chief. Customers rose from their booths to watch through the glass. The diner that had welcomed people seeking nothing more than breakfast had unexpectedly become the place where character, accountability, and leadership were about to meet face to face. As the front door opened once again, the police chief stepped inside, his expression serious after receiving the governor's call, and every person in the room understood that the consequences of that morning were only beginning to unfold. The police chief removed his hat as he stepped into Miller's diner, his eyes moving first to Senator Evelyn Carter and then to Officer Brandon Hayes. The room remained silent, every customer understanding that this moment would be remembered long after breakfast dishes had been cleared away. The chief walked directly toward Evelyn and extended his hand. "Senator Carter, on behalf of this department, I sincerely apologize for the way your morning has unfolded." Evelyn accepted the handshake with quiet dignity. "Thank you, Chief. My hope is that today becomes an opportunity to strengthen trust rather than weaken it." The chief nodded thoughtfully before turning toward Hayes. His voice remained calm, but the disappointment behind it was unmistakable. "Officer Hayes, I have already spoken with the governor and with the Department of Public Safety. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty pending a formal administrative review. Please surrender your department credentials and accompany the responding supervisor after we finish here." Hayes closed his eyes for a brief moment before removing his badge and identification from his uniform. There was no argument, no attempt to defend himself, only the heavy realization that a single morning shaped by assumptions had changed the course of his career. He placed the badge into the chief's waiting hand. The polished metal that had once symbolized authority now seemed to represent responsibility instead. Hayes looked toward Evelyn. "Senator Carter, I cannot undo what happened today, but I accept responsibility for my decisions. I should have listened before reaching conclusions." Evelyn answered with the same calm grace she had shown from the beginning. Accountability is never the end of a person's story. It is the beginning of personal growth, if someone is willing to learn. Those words settled over the diner more powerfully than applause ever could. Grace Miller quietly refilled Evelyn's coffee one final time before the senator prepared to leave for the Capitol. Noah Brooks stopped his recording and slipped his phone back into his apron, realizing he had witnessed something far more meaningful than an argument. He had watched patience overcome pride without anyone raising a voice. The elderly veteran smiled gently as Evelyn walked past his table. "Thank you for choosing dignity," he said. Evelyn returned the smile. "It is the only path that leaves room for justice." Outside, the morning sky had completely cleared. Sunlight reflected across the rain-soaked pavement as the governor's security vehicle waited near the entrance. Before stepping outside, Evelyn paused and looked back at the people inside the diner. "Every badge deserves respect," she said, "because every badge represents a promise. But that promise only remains strong when it is guided by fairness, humility, and truth." The chief lowered his head in agreement. Several customers quietly applauded, not because someone powerful had entered the room, but because they had witnessed character refuse to surrender to humiliation. As Evelyn entered the waiting vehicle and the convoy departed toward the state capitol, the diner slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Coffee was poured again. Conversations resumed. Plates were cleared from tables. Yet no one present would ever see that familiar corner booth in quite the same way again. They would remember that justice had not arrived with anger, revenge, or humiliation. It had arrived through patience, truth, accountability, and the courage to treat every person with equal dignity before making judgment. Because a uniform can command attention, a title can command influence, but only character earns lasting respect. And on that quiet morning inside a small American diner, everyone learned that the strongest authority will always belong to the truth.